one of the things I really admire about his take on that is for him, he'll flat out say, this is like a siren call to museums to pay attention to this stuff.
He doesn't put up with
Okay.
nonsense, right? So the whole spin doctor kind of PR thing is not something that Kirk Johnson is really that. He's not putting up
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah, I really loved his writing style. It's like very easy to read, very informative. I mean, it's this book just you kind of breeze through. It's just so like captivating. And so I think kind of for our listeners, like this is exciting because we're kind of doing this mini series. We haven't really done this before. We've always focused on a bird, but I know we've talked a lot of times about doing a feather thief episode, and people really are drawn to it. Even people that aren't super into birding have read this book and kind of gotten more into museums and into birds. And so I think kind of before we get into it, we're going to do this kind of chronologically and go through some different chapters. But maybe this being our first episode, we can kind of go through and say like why we're doing this series on the feather thief.
Well, I mean, I think some of it's that people have a general fascination with crime,
Yeah.
and and so this is an incredible crime story, and for us in the ornithology community, particularly in the ornithology collections community, it's an incredible indication of how we need to protect these collections for the long term, for the science that we care about. And if you don't do that, bad things can happen. And
Well,
this
Yeah.
is a really bad thing in that sense.
I have to say that listening to this has the first time I read it, and now I decided to listen to it just to see if I had a different reaction to this story and to this book through his own words, which I think is really important because his emphasis and the things that you can tell in the tone of his voice what is important to him and what he's emphasizing. But I have to say it's making me literally sick to my stomach to listen to him tell the story. I mean, so much so that it's safer to go to murder podcasts, which is kind of where I started in podcasts. I mean, it literally made me throw up. It makes me throw up to listen to this story, to think of someone, because it's a real violation of trust. We have people in our institution, they ask us, and we're very open because I think specimens are more valued, more valuable, the more they're used. Museums become more important the more open we are to having people see what we do and why and what we have. And so to have that trust violated like that in this way it makes me sick to my stomach. And then to hear the fact that that kid suffered no consequences really from what he did, which to me is an incredible violation. These specimens are a sacred trust that we have, and I feel lucky that we've been entrusted with their care for the time that we have, the jobs that we do, and the idea that someone we let in the collections would do that is just. I mean, even now I can feel myself getting tense. I actually checked my blood pressure as I was listening to Kurt talk this morning, and it went up, like way, way up. That's how kind of disturbing I find the idea of this violation of
So
trust.
Shannon, I want to ask, are you talking about the trust violation by the kid who committed the robbery, or by the trust violation by the British Museum
Both,
and how they
actually.
kind of had poor accounting?
Yeah,
Okay.
they both make
'Cause that-
they
to me,
both make me sick to my
Yeah.
stomach. What I mean, I don't think you can just brush it under aside and then go on with your life. A lot of academics do that, right? They just brush aside behavioral problems, scientific misconduct, or fraud. Our institution is famous for doing things like this. They all are, and so are people. But this story doesn't. It's just way worse. For me, maybe that's not true for other people, but as someone who's supposed to be caring for the collections, this strikes me as just the worst of things that can happen. To tear the tags off of these birds and to cut them into
R-
pieces.
R- R-
Okay.
RJ, why don't you
Wait, so
why don't you lay the
yeah,
because you guys brought this to
yeah,
us, and
yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's
So I
important here.
think yes, I think we've both read the book years ago, and I think when we first, John, when we first met you at the Field Museum, and we were, went through and looked at all the specimen, it was like 3/4 of our group were all like, "Have you seen the Feather Thief? Have you read the Feather Thief?" Everyone was talking about it, and it was almost like, I mean, we were so like into it when we were reading it, and it was just eye opening to see everything and see like how big these collections are, and hearing about them from his writing was like made us realize really how important they were, and then seeing them firsthand with you was just like completely fascinating. And it's almost like as we've started this podcast, everyone that we reach out to asks us, have you read The Feather Thief? It's like really has taken people, people are super into it. And I think, we're so into the book, and we're so lucky to talk to both you, John and Shannon, because I think really you two are more qualified than most people in the world to speak on this based on what you both do. So I'd love, before we kind of kick all this off, for our listeners that aren't fully familiar with what both of you do, and people that are new that are just joining, John and Shannon, if you want to give a little bit of background of what you do, and how that's applicable to what we're going to talk about with the Feather Thief.
We're curators of one of the larger bird collections in the world, and our goal is to make those data available to people now and have that be something that people can go back to into the future. So as Shannon was saying, I mean, we know that these specimens actually, in reality, only get more valuable scientifically over time if they're taken care of and they're there for people to look at, because they represent information about a given species. And to me, this is really about biodiversity. This is less about people than it is about
No,
biodiversity.
I don't. No. I mean,
But it is, that's the way I feel about it.
no, it touches on some of the worst aspects of human nature and behavior, in my mind. And it connects the past to the present and then into the future because of the way he weaves this story through time, and why this story resonates for him. So, there was a theft at the British Museum. This is how he starts the book, a theft of specimens at the British Museum. And to me, for that 20-year-old to break in first off into the museum, to have used the museum to gain access to know what was there and where it physically was in the building, it's murder to me. Because I view these specimens as immortality. The birds are immortal because they're in collections, and we care for them, and we make sure that they're cared for and available for study and into the future. So this is my version of immortality. You can have religious tones for me, but so that is he murdered. That's not just, there was no scientific value to what happened in that. He violated the trust of every scientist and every person. He violated that trust, and he violated that institutions.
And I'll just
Everything.
reiterate that to me it's all about the biodiversity. It's literally what these collections represent, which are years of work to build up a compilation of geographic variation and representation of specimens from different time periods.
He
And
cut the tags off, John. He cut
I
the
know.
tags off. That is, I, I can't even tell you how horrified the idea of purposefully cutting tags off and separating the data from the bird itself, not let alone then ripping the feathers out to tie flies, which is absolutely insane to me.
To you, right? And I think that's one of the crazy things about this book is recognizing there are people out there, and one of the things I love that Kirk Johnson does in the book is pointing out that in the early 1900s, people were going all over the world to kill hummingbirds and birds of paradise and to bring those feathers back and put them in women's hats.
Well, that's an interesting thing. I think one of the reasons why this book resonates with people is because if you look at the history of Vogue magazine and Ladies' Home Journal, they're all intimately tied in with this feather fever, which kind of forms the basis of the social aspect of it. But there's a scientific aspect which I love. Him talking about Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace and the development of scientific theories associated with evolution. And all of these are tied time-wise in very close proximity to this feather fever, all of the time when people are starting to travel all over the world and collect things and put them in museums. So there's no distinguishing kind of how these things happen. It's just that the fever changes through time, right? Mm-hmm. So the feather fever from women's hats spawned the Audubon Society, spawned the protection of birds, including through laws. And that has to do with women taking ownership over themselves and changing the idea of what a woman was. But there's no women in the fly tie community, which is something I also find really interesting too. That is a completely male-dominated.
Well,
I don't know about that.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, there are
there
are no women that tie flies in that community. None.
but yes,
I don't understand. What do you mean?
That create the actual flies,
Yeah,
not that are
exactly.
fly fisher women.
Yeah, there are
right?
women who are.
I've tied my own flies.
Oh.
I mean, people do that. Yeah, but not for art.
Right. Yeah, in this community,
Right.
it's almost completely male dominated. There are
Yeah.
no women on these.
so
On the dark
there's
web.
there's an irony to all of this to me in that this 20-year-old kid got interested in fly tying, got interested in the competitive aspect of it, got introduced to these Victorian types of flies. And one thing you won't see is it's not like women are going to resurrect putting the feathers of birds of paradise into their hats anytime soon. I just don't think that's going to happen. But it's very clear that this community is completely interested in maintaining these Victorian recipes for making these what are truly works of art, as you said. I mean, they're amazing looking things, but that they have to have feathers of rare and endangered birds to do that is just absolutely amazing to me.
So he does a really good job of weaving together all these independent stories that involve both science and culture, worldwide culture too, into this really compelling story that reads like I don't think people would make that up. I think it had to happen for people to think that it's something that could happen, that they could make up stories about. This is not, is not common. But the fear of this is something that every museum lives with. We have locks on our cabinets that are out in the areas that people can go through. You need keys to get in and see them. And for these purposes, for even the potential for theft or maybe the actual theft of some of our specimens historically made people put locks on all of our cabinets. And again, that's not a cheap thing to do, right? When we don't have extra money, the idea of extra security associated with, well, we don't even have enough money to buy pins and tape and tubes to put tissues in, let alone the elaborate security that is needed to protect people from doing things that seem inconceivable.
And how large is the collection at the Field Museum, just so people get an understanding of this? Because, kind of in the prologue, Kirk kind of lays out, him breaking into the museum, but you don't really get a grasp of like the scale of how large these collections are and keeping them safe, like you're saying, and locking everything up.
So we have
this
over
takes up so much.
600,000 specimens in our collections now, and it's on 1, 2, 3, 5 floors in the museum
Wow.
have specimens of birds on them.
And
Wow.
and the British Museum is the largest collection of birds in the world.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I really liked kind of how he in the prologue kind of lays out the crime at the beginning. It really kind of grabs you and grabs your attention, and you know something happens, and then it kind of he switches over to kind of his perspective and how Kirk is kind of on this personal journey, trying to find his way, and here's this story, and it kind of grabs his attention so much that he decides to write all about it. And so I love like kind of laying that out to start, because it really is like, oh, there's a crime, and then how do we get here? And then Shannon, like you were saying, he kind of weaves in all of these different stories, and I really love how he starts with Alfred Russel Wallace, kind of at the very first thing, because I feel like as a when I first read this, I was not familiar with the specimen collections, and really have learned like through the two of you. But by him starting out with like everything that Alfred Russel Wallace went through to collect all of these, you really get a sense of like all of the different years that he put into it, and also kind of the importance as they've been preserved over time. So maybe we should just kind of kick it off and talk about the first chapter with Alfred Russel Wallace and get through that a little bit to start it
I
off.
want to back up just a tiny bit, and this is a
Sure.
perspective thing for me. One of the things that grabbed me when I started reading, especially to understand how Kurt himself became interested in this through his own experiences as a fisherman, a fly fisherman. And to me, it reminded me really closely of how really good research projects come to be, which is you get bizarre ideas from bizarre places that can include standing in a river with a guide who tells you something that makes you think about the world in a different way. And that's what happens with good science projects. They're collaborative with people who have different ideas and different experiences, different backgrounds, different perspectives. And so that's kind of what got me at first, is that because it really mimics that process, which to me is so intimately tied with the kind of science that at least that I do, and the kind of unpredictable nature of where ideas come from. And so that's why you can't manufacture that. But what he did is take that and turn it into something. Like he didn't just keep it private, which he could have, right? But he actually, as a journalist, he actually went through the process and went all over the world understanding things, talking to experts, talking to collections, trying to tell the whole part of the story. And so I admire that a lot, because that's a lot of dedication to something that started from standing in a body of water with a guide at a time in his life when he was pretty vulnerable to what he was going to do next. And he was open about that vulnerability, which is usually not part of science, but I think should be. So I give him a lot of credit for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I give tours like I did to you guys when you came by the museum that first time, I often emphasize to people, and I can't remember whether, I mean, I think I was doing it before the Feather Thief, but I've been a lot of places collecting birds, and every single bird requires an hour to several hours of my time to actually prepare as a specimen and take all those data. And so there's a whole nother aspect of this when, he's talking about, oh yeah, these guys are meticulous with their fruit fly tires. Well, as you mentioned with Wallace went around the world, had these, evolved, as Shannon was saying, these scientific recognition that geography mattered, and was trying to get data about the birds to support that would come back and be in collections so that it could be looked at comparatively. One of the crazy things about geography is if you're on one island in the South Pacific and you collect something, you don't necessarily know how that compares to other islands unless you have specimens to look at it and that's why collections evolved in the first place, was to bring that stuff together so you could begin to see these differences. And every single one of those specimens becomes this network, but every single one of them took somebody going to some far-flung place, doing the work in the field to get that specimen and prepare it and take the data too. And so, when we come back to, I don't know, I'm saying that biodiversity is the thing that loses out on all this, which I still think is true. But at the same time, it's amazing the amount of effort that it takes to build a collection the size of the British museums, for instance.
Well, and when you think about what Wallace went through, he lost his collections, right? It didn't stop him, which is unbelievable. I would probably never come out of my room again if a fire burned up everything that I had been spending all that time working, and all I'd gotten was a couple of notebooks out of my cabin. I mean, he lost 10,000 birds in that fire on that ship, and that is, again, it didn't stop him, right? So scientists are weird. Well, people in general are weird, right? So that same dedication is what makes the fly tie people do what they do. But in this case, Wallace wasn't going to let that. He didn't give up, right? He wasn't done learning.
And that was based on his work in Amazonia. And he was the first person, at least credited with writing about the idea that rivers played a major role in distributional boundaries in Amazonian birds, which is just an incredibly important part of Amazonian evolutionary history. And yeah, I mean, so you think about the information that was lost in that fire.
Yeah.
And
It was 4 years of research, I think. 4 years that he was collecting.
Yeah.
and
then
he was, I mean, we're talking 365 days a year of doing stuff. It's not like, I look at what those folks did relative to what we do now, where we might go out for 3 weeks or 4 weeks and feel like we've had a long trip.
Right.
Yeah, it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
And science
And
is
then,
cumulative knowledge too. So it's not that, and the specimens are like this for real. At the base of this is, you don't turn away from what they have to say because technology gets better. So it's not like me thinking my first iPad, well, that's ridiculous now, or thinking what I can do in my phone that you can't, you could never do even 5 years ago with a supercomputer. So it's not like that. I mean, the specimens are the constant, and the ideas that come from the specimens that the scientists have are always the things that you go back to. So what did so-and-so say about this? And that always spawns new research. It always generates new ideas, no matter how old things might seem. So that's the immortality part of these specimens.
Wow.
That's why the idea that you would separate some of this from their basics is just, it's like tearing your children in half and not being able to unite them. I have a lot of hatred for that kid, actually. I'm surprisingly amount of a lack of toleration for what he did. It's just such an egregious crime, even though it seems trivial to other people, right? Nobody died, nothing like that. But
No, it's so interesting to hear you talk about this, Shannon, because you're bringing up a perspective that I never thought about, like when I was reading the book. So it's so interesting to hear your, personal view on that.
So talk a little bit about your fish fly tying background.
Yeah.
I used to say I don't have a deep background, but that's something like if you fly fish, like we lived in Steamboat, Colorado, so that's a big thing out there. In fooling around with that, I never did a really good job. So, and I was always scared of, hurting the fish when I was taking off the hook. So I would always pin the barb. I'd take my pliers and make the barb like flat. So that was something that was good for me. And I would do that with like the flies that I bought too. So, but yeah, if it's not necessarily cheaper to make your own flies, but if you're interested in, you know, fooling around with it, maybe if you're really good, you can get it so it's cheaper. But yeah, it was just something like if you fly fish, I feel like it's something everybody at least fools around with a little bit. But yeah, I don't have a deep background in it, but I feel like it's something everybody toys with if you do it.
I mean, did you
So-
know there was such a black market? That's probably the most surprising thing that came out of this. The idea that there was an underground dark web black market associated with fly ties. It just I had
Yes.
no idea.
No.
And I had no idea just how rabid the people who belonged in that community could be.
Yeah.
Where did you
Me
get your
neither.
feathers, Amanda?
Oh, you buy them in kits, and they're all like chicken feathers that are dyed. Like
Okay.
it's all birds that were gonna die anyways.
I mean, this is the thing, right? It's not like feathers are hard to come by.
Right.
It's in
Right.
general, it's that they
Yeah.
had to have these specific feathers from these specific species of birds in order for it to be what they wanted and actually still want. One thing I want to emphasize is this has not gone away.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought Kirk in his email, John, didn't he say that he thinks that the need for it has almost grown since the book, which is scary, right?
It is.
It
You know,
is
Yeah.
scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but again, I think about maybe, you know, what I'd like to see is what happened with the millinery trade in the sense that people came to their senses and said, this is a really bad thing. And I think
Women
a lot of the
came
problem
to
is
their senses, John. Women came to their senses and
enough.
stopped the feather fever, and they didn't just stop the feather fever either, which is, you know, the good part of human nature at times, is that they actually created things that were really important for birds, kind of an atonement to that, you know, to create laws, to create organizations dedicated to the preservation of birds instead of the exploitation of feathers. And so that's a good thing. I mean, CITES is a good thing. I know we have a mixed relationship with CITES, granted, just because of the permitting that we have to go through in order to import, to both sample and import birds.
Which we should be clear. So CITES is the international legislation on the trade in endangered species, and this is an international set of laws that everybody has to follow, and it's designed to curb some of the things that are obviously bigger than fish fly ties, like people trying to get access to rhino horn for selling to Asian markets and things. So it's a bigger thing, but
this
yeah,
happens
I mean, these are
to this day. We have good relationships with Fish and Wildlife and with Customs and Border Protection at O'Hare Airport, and they are pretty consistently asking us to identify things, asking to use our collections so they can figure out what things are, because people are smuggling both dead and live. Imagine that, stuffing your pants with live parrots and, you know, trying to slit the eyes of live hummingbirds so that they're quiet and docile as they stuff them in their pants to bring them in. So, you know, the stories of that Kirk tells are, you know, they're graphic and dramatic, but it's not, it happens today that people are still
real,
trying to
yeah.
do that, smuggling in birds in suitcases and milk cans and coffee cans and all, you know.
And I liked Kirk kind of weaved into when he was talking about Wallace, that Wallace had the realization, you know, as he's doing all this for science, that he thinks that maybe this isn't a good thing overall because people are going to find out about these and exploit it. He says, like, this consideration, he concluded, must surely tell us that all living things were not made for man. So it's like he had this inkling that by kind of doing all of this research that there was going to be kind of this dark side, even like while he was doing this. I mean, it took, not long after him to start exploiting that, but I like the fact that he had this realization while he's doing that.
Yeah.
But I think that's because he had a long idea. The idea of the long history of the Earth came from this idea of geography and at the same time, so that the world wasn't just 6,000 years old or really recent, that there was a long history of life on Earth before humans ever came to be. So, and that was pretty heretical at the time, right? The idea that everything wasn't created by God in God's image to be used by man. That was pretty heretical for him to think about it that way, that, birds of paradise existed way before there were ever people there. So clearly they weren't created for man's pleasure to watch them display or to look at their feathers, which is, why we should be honoring the products of the process of evolutionary history through time, not just exploiting them for human benefit, whether that's for a hat or a fly tie. I mean, there are things that can be done that are legal with respect to these considerations, right? That don't require sacrificing rare endangered birds.
Yeah, at the same time, I think Wallace had seen on his travels how various native communities use feathers all the time in various ornamentation and rituals and things. And so, this is something humans have a fairly long historical habit of doing, with the one caveat that this takes it to a whole nother level in terms of the bizarreness of it.
I have a hypothetical, and so this is, I mean, I feel like everyone kind of is drawn to Wallace. He has this, horrific, like, the fire happening is so tragic to his research, and we talked about how most people would just give up after that, and really he doubles down, and that's when he decides to go to, look for the birds of paradise. And do you all think that if his trip to the Amazon had been a success, that he would have been motivated to go out? I mean, would he have just kind of been content bringing all of his stuff back?
No,
Yeah, you think he would have?
100%. I mean, look at the way John lives his stuff. There are things
Yeah.
that people who have that kind of wanderlust, that, I mean, not that it might not have spurred more, but I don't think there's any way he was going to stop. I mean,
I'm gonna disagree. I'm gonna disagree with that. Only because, and then I'm not sure. I mean, this is, Darwin went on one trip. Yes, it was around the world, but he went on one trip. He did a lot of stuff in London, in England, but basically never traveled after that. And what I was going to say is, if Wallace had gotten back with 10,000 specimens of birds,
no, geography never would have let him do that. So Darwin had these ideas about evolution that could be fulfilled by the intellectual part, could be fulfilled by that. But if geography is your thing, as it was for Wallace, there's no way Wallace is stopping after one. There's just no way. And he was,
except that so the question is, who would have described those 10,000 birds in the way that they needed to be described? And it might have been Wallace, but he might have left them for somebody else.
yeah,
for
Darwin didn't describe the birds. He left them for other people. He got the ideas out of it, right? So there were other taxonomists and systematists of the time who actually worked up the describing of that variation. So
I mean, he worked with John Gould, but I think, well, I don't know. I mean, I think I love the question because one, it's unanswerable at some level, but
Sure.
I mean, I've
Would you
actually
have not gone to Africa because you spent all that time in South America before you went to Africa? There's no way, John. There's just no way.
But this is, but the period of time we're talking about, the 1850s versus today, I think is so different.
Yeah,
we
there
have
was a
such
lot more to
access to the,
learn then. He was like
for
the
sure.
pioneer in doing that with those ideas. I, his whole story is really fascinating to me because it highlights
Yeah.
other aspects of science that I find both troubling and interesting, which is that he came along, he was like the nipping at the heels of Darwin, right? But not in a
Hmm.
competitive way, which I find this is why I find him so compelling, is that he there's too much of science that's competitive and exclusionary. So people don't want you to see X, Y, or Z because they want to do it and they don't want to share either the specimens, they don't want to share the credit, they don't want to share ideas because they want to hold them all to themselves, like kind of stamp collectors do. But that was not Wallace's perspective at all. He wanted to talk to Darwin about what it was he was finding. He wasn't not in a competitive way, and it actually triggered Darwin's competitive instincts too to try to be gracious or generous with his ideas. And I imagine that was, you can see it in Darwin's writing that there was a dynamic touching his own ego in that. But Wallace didn't have that. He didn't do that, right? He didn't just say, "Oh, woe is me, someone beat me to the punch." He took his own perspective and direction on that
So
in what I think is the best of science, these collaborative ideas of people who have different perspectives, building off of what people who came before you did and being the building point for the people who come after you.
so
So,
a number of years ago, I got to spend a day at the British Museum, and one of the things I was interested in was looking at specimens of this little. It's called a grass quit. It's a South American finch, and I was going through the drawers that they had of this South American finch, which is pretty widespread, and I found a specimen collected by Wallace, and it looks like it could be the first specimen from the Amazon basin of a species that has a really patchy distribution in eastern South America. And I've never actually written that up, but I'd like to do more to try to confirm that that's actually what that bird really is, like get a topad sample and do DNA work. But it just highlights the fact that those collections that were lost were probably full of really valuable tidbits of scientific knowledge that just a tragic loss. And so then the idea that somebody could walk into that museum and take 299 specimens of these birds just for fish fly tying, it's
Hmm.
crazy.
John, when you were at the museum, I was curious, I've only seen pictures of it, and I think Kirk has a few pictures like in his actual book. And I was just curious, like it looks like kind of an older building, and I mean, you go to the Field Museum and it's like a fortress. It's like, but I feel like is the museum, does it seem very updated security wise and everything like that? Or does it kind of seem like an old building?
Oh
I don't know if you can
yeah,
see that.
it
So
does
that's
look like
that's
an old
not
building.
the building the collections are
That's
in.
not okay. Phew.
That's
Okay.
that's the building the museum's in. They built another building, but
Okay.
what I would tell you is the most important thing to recognize there is that for various, I think Kirk goes into the background in terms of how Tring ended up being the place that happened to house the British Museum's collection of birds. It was the Rothschild estate, and Rothschild was one of the primary benefactors to the British Museum early on and loved birds. And so that's why it's there. But what I would also point out to people is that it's completely removed from the hustle and bustle of scientific activity.
Mm.
And there's some significant things that we can talk about in the next episode as time goes on about the implications of that. In other words,
Mm.
if you put your collections out in the middle of nowhere, they're basically going to be out in the middle of nowhere. That doesn't make them less valuable, except that people can't get at them very easily, and so they tend not to use them as much.
So that's an important difference between our museum and that historically. We have so many people in the collections every day that doing that, you could never do that in that same way. Because if you were not supposed to be doing things, someone would walk by you and say, what are you doing? And so we rely on people, just like they relied on the security guard who, well, was or was not watching a soccer game. Hey, I've watched hockey games in the museum plenty of times, and my niece's lacrosse games too. But we rely on security to do that. The security guards go through the museum every day, multiple times at night, even, and we need that to happen, so that we do not have these kinds of theft things. I might think birds are the most important things in the museum, but there's obviously some historical artifacts in anthropology collections that are incalculably valuable, that need to have eyes on them all the time. So like John says, if you put things away in a closet, I mean, how many times have you pulled things out of a closet and said, oh, I forgot about this, right? And that's what happens to specimens if they're not used. Oh, I forgot about this. Oh, I forget about your museum, because you don't let anybody in. You don't make it easy for people to know what you have. The web has made access to collections easier, which is really important. But, there's something about physically being able to see the specimens. You're not going to get that from a database.
Right.
You get lots from a database, but you're not going to know what John said, which is, what is this grass quit? Is it really is it this, or isn't it this? You can't know that from a database. Can't know that from a picture. You need to have comparative material that you can look at, which is one of the reasons historically why the British Museum is so important, because they have so many historically significant specimens. But they also don't document in the same way modern biodiversity in Europe, which I think is, doesn't make their collections important 100 years from now the way that 100 years ago specimens are important to science, because things change, and museums need to be have constant representation of what the biodiversity of that region is in them.
I mean, but the British Museum is still an extremely relevant collection.
Of course.
One of our graduate students is going to be going there in the next couple of weeks to look at European goldfinches. Louise, who's been on one of the previous podcasts, and that's because
awesome.
they have the best historical material of European goldfinches from the UK and probably a lot of other parts of the world.
Right. So if you think about understanding introductions that have happened across the world, well, they have the place you have to go to find out what they were before they were introduced. And we don't have that.
Right.
We don't have that material because our collections aren't as significant from that time period or from that place. So, it takes a village of collections to actually try to start untangling how biodiversity came to be. No one place has everything. And maybe when you look at the feather thief or you look at some of these things, that's a good thing, right? Because one single fire can't destroy everything we might know about biodiversity, which, when you watch the museum in Brazil burn to the ground, it's
So this was what happened at the National Museum at Rio. But one of the things I always point out there that I always think about is, and it holds with respect to the feather thief, is there was one guy in charge of the entire safety of that collection at that point, which meant that it was very easy for Edwin Russ to break in and do what he did. And I always like to think that, say at the Field Museum, for instance, there are more people in the building at any given time. And it's one of the reasons why I've always said, if I've got a graduate student or somebody on the staff that wants to work at night, I'm okay with that.
Yeah,
there has to be a level.
There was
Have
a
some eyes on
fire in
there.
exhibitions. It happened, this is a while ago, but one of our collections people often works through the night, late at night, and he found the fire before it burned. It could have been a lot
Oh,
worse,
wow.
right? So if a fire
Thank
starts at
God.
1 a.m. in a part of the museum and nobody's in there really until 8 or 9 in the morning, that's a long time for a fire to burn. In this case, it got found out right away, and so it does. It takes a lot of different kinds of people. Just like when we talked about McCormick Place and the fact that it takes a village to prevent birds from killing themselves en masse at McCormick Place. It's not just us, the people who own the building, the politicians, the people who secure the buildings, the vendors who come in to do things, the cleaning staff. All of these people need to be having their processes in place to prevent that building from killing more birds. It's not just us saying so.
Right. I was wondering when this theft first occurred, or I should say, was discovered, did you two hear about it from like a museum gossip perspective, or was it not until like the feather thief that you really knew about this story? And like, did this inform any of your security procedures?
So the quick answer is that it got around to the community pretty quickly. They didn't publicize it very much. And so when I say pretty quickly, within months after it happened, people began to hear about it.
Well, months after it was discovered, because it took a while for them to even figure out that there were birds missing. Right. So
It took a month or so.
Right.
So there's such a lag time. That's a bad thing. Because
Yeah.
he could have gone to a bunch of other museums and done the same thing before anybody realized. So, we can be grateful that that didn't happen, or he wasn't working with a whole crew of feather thieves. But
Right.
But I also want to tell a specific story because I'm in the acknowledgments in the book in part because Kirk called up because he was looking for photos of specimens that were collected by Wallace in collections, and he was having trouble getting permission. And we have some Wallace specimens in our collection, and so we took some pictures and sent them to him. But the other thing that happened was he got in contact with the curator of birds at Yale University, Rick Prum, and Rick had been interested in the story about the feather thief, and so Rick had started doing some of his own sleuthing into the kind of dark web associated with the fish fly tying community, and the two of them got together. And I got a call one day in my office, and it was Rick saying, do you know about this theft? And it was like, sure. And it said, well, we've been looking on the dark web, and I just sent you an email with a picture we just found of Field Museum birds specimens.
Jeez.
And my heart just sunk because I just thought, holy crap. And I pulled up the email, and it was even worse than I kind of thought when I saw the picture, which was that the picture was some tanager specimens from South America. And I could very clearly see the tags as Field Museum tags. And I could very clearly see that they were recent Field Museum tags from one of my graduate students who was doing work in Peru. And I just went downstairs and I went to the case that those birds were supposed to be in, and I opened it, and all those birds were still there. And what they were doing were just sharing photos of interesting looking birds on a dark website that somebody had posted from the Field Museum collection. And I've never discouraged anybody from taking pictures of our collection. That's actually a way to get information out there. But if you had ever told me that I would get a call like that, where we might have been looking at a situation where...
To me, that's like an episode of Criminal Minds, that TV show where, sexual predators are sharing images of, of bad things, little kids or whatever, as inspiration to, for other people to do the same thing. And that's kind of what it reminded me of, to see that, is that, you're putting that out there as if to say, come to the Field Museum and see if you can get after these things. It seemed it's so dirty. Anyways, I've made this very personal, as you can tell. It feels really, really, really personal, like a personal attack to do that to specimens. It feels like a personal attack. So it's not academic. It's extremely emotional.
Yeah.
Well, that's some great perspective.
Did this incident mark a turning point in how other museums conducted security?
So, good question. Maybe, maybe not. And it's such a double-edged sword. And this is something that I've always appreciated when Kirk, when he talks in public about this, kind of emphasizes, because he's really concerned that institutions haven't taken this seriously enough.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, if we make our collections less accessible, we're not helping the mission of what we're there for, which is to preserve biodiversity and get people to appreciate it and access it. So for instance, if we stopped giving tours behind the scenes, we wouldn't be doing this podcast right now.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's like, no, we can't do that. And
But it
I don't
does.
know. I mean,
it
this is
does
just-
showcase, though, the need for resources in institutions. So, I mean, I don't know a single museum that has more money than it could use, that doesn't sacrifice some things for other things. So, how much money are you going to put into security? John and I can chafe at that sometimes too. It's like, oh my God, we don't have enough people to prepare specimens. We don't have enough people to go through the collections, make sure there aren't bugs eating them, to make sure that the specimens that are pickled have enough alcohol in them, not enough money to buy tubes for tissue collections, or enough money to buy the big giant vessels that tissue collections sit in. So, when money goes into security, you're like, oh my God. But everybody's so under-resourced. Where do you put what are your priorities? And it's super hard, even for people like us, the idea of putting money into security. Nobody wants to live in a Big Brother state where you're being constantly filmed doing everything. That's really creepy, and that's a lot of modern society these days that is, can be very uncomfortable. And I don't want to turn our collections into that either. I don't want to discourage people from using them. The only way to preserve birds is for people to know. The only way for collections to get money is for people to understand their basic missions and what the people do. And that requires access. So it's a balance of those things. I mean, John does this we all do this all the time. There's incredible delight that happens when we show people the collections. It's not just what happens to you when you see something that you've never seen before. It's something that happens with us as we share our stories, right? So it's not a one-way street of you being excited to see our collections. It's us being happy to tell people the stories and to develop our abilities to tell people what we do, which is every time we give a tour, we develop better, which is why all of our students are encouraged to give tours to people, to talk about things, which is why that case that you've come into is so important. And it's still my favorite part of the museum is to see case 484 and realize all of the people who have come through that have stood at that case and had biodiversity stories told to them. From every person has their own stories to tell from the specimens. They never tell the same story. And to me, that's fantastic. And that's needed. It's why we exist in the museum. It's why people get different educations when they come and do that. And it's why when they go out in their careers afterwards, they carry that with them, like a fine piece of jewelry that they can carry with them for forever. It becomes part of your DNA.
That's awesome. I love that, Shannon.
Yeah.
It definitely made such an impact on Amanda and I to go visit. And I mean, I guess I hadn't really thought about how special it is for you to be able to show that to people. Has got to be, I mean, even better than
Well, you
what we
develop
experienced. So
lifelong
that's so
relationships with people who, once you've done that with them, they update you, they let you know. John's had many long-term relationships with kids that he's shown a bird specimen to when they were 8 years old, right? So it really matters a lot.
I like the fact that I have long-term relationships with those specimens.
It's true, actually.
Well, and I think
Yeah.
that's one of the things we admire so much about you two is how much you enjoy your job and how much
Yes.
I mean, you guys really love what you do. And I mean, that's really pretty spectacular. And so, I mean, that's something that really shows and that we love. So
Yeah.
People need to be committed to things, right? Whatever it is, be committed. Except fly tie fishing and bird specimens. Do not be obsessed with that, and do not go out of your way with respect to that. But
or use chicken feathers if you do.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, just-
I mean,
How
there's
about just don't break the law? Yeah.
yeah.
well, the
Well,
laws are
and-
trailing indicators, right? What is this kid going to be? What is the charge, right?
Oh, that's
This is not so. The world changes, and laws sometimes don't catch up very quickly to the modern world.
The crazy thing about this is he never served any time for
it's
the
crazy.
crime, and I think a lot of people
So curious about that.
yeah, and a lot of people didn't think it was such a big deal. I mean, when you look at the book, actually, I was horrified when I first Googled things in preparation for this and Googled Edwin Rist. What came up was Edwin Rist, ornithologist.
Oh gosh.
How's that for? It's like, and so I think
That's insane.
it's crazy, but some people think, well, it just wasn't that big a deal.
Gosh.
We've gotten to the point where I think with rhino horns, people will say, okay, rhino horns are a big deal. Well, this was a huge deal too, certainly
Yeah.
for our community, and it's good to be talking about it. Simply because if you don't talk about it, I think it's just sweeping it under the rug at some
I mean,
level.
it's like
Yeah.
preventative medicine, right? You don't not have a heart attack because you ignored the fact that your heart. I mean, I feel this way about hearing loss, for example, that there's such shame for people with hearing loss. They don't want to wear hearing aids. It's just so underneath, so uncomfortable for people to admit that they have a disability, or they're experiencing something like that. And that's what happened. That's what the British Museum's reaction to this reminded me of, is the shame is such that you just want to shove it
Shame.
under the carpet and not deal with
Yeah.
it, when you really should just say, yeah, I can't hear out of my right ear. Don't talk to me in my right ear. I tell John that all the time. I can't find a bird. I don't know where you are in the house. Stop it. I'm not going to feel ashamed about it. I wish I had a sign on the top of my head that said, don't talk to me in my right ear. I can't hear anything out of that ear. And so to destigmatize a failing is really is a lesson that should be learned from this. It's like, acknowledge what you did and then tell people what you did to prevent it from happening again, so that people can learn from what is a horrible incident. People need to learn from it.
But see, that's the thing is with this kind of thing, one of the primary responses to prevention is not to tell people anything. So you think that you've actually taken measures that might thwart somebody that they can't plan for.
I mean, do you think the death penalty prevents people from murdering people? It doesn't at all. Do you think the fact that there are so many people in prison who didn't do what they did, getting back to my roots of podcasting and murder realms, it doesn't stop people from doing things. It doesn't stop people from wanting to kill people, the government from wanting to kill people, that there are people on death row who didn't do what they were accused of doing. So, that's not the cure. That's not the cure for human ills.
This is why I always bring it back around to biodiversity.
chicken. It's all integrated in my mind. I can't separate them.
I think this might be a good place to close it out on this one. I did have one question I meant to ask earlier, and it was one of Russell's people that he studied with, an entomologist named Henry Bates in the Amazon. Any relation,
yeah.
John?
Boy, I have been asked that question more than once, and the answer is no.
No,
But I
okay.
certainly knows who he was. There's a
Okay.
spectacular woodcutting of him out in the Amazon basin with curl crested ericeres flying all around him. And so he was on the, he did a lot of beetle work for the most part.
Oh, okay. I'm glad I waited till the end to ask that, because if you were like, yeah, he's my grandpa.
No,
We
like,
want
whoa.
to talk about that more. Yeah.
No, it's just another one of those explorers like Alfred Russell Wallace, an amazing guy.
Cool.
Very cool.
All right. Well, I think we can wrap it up then. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.